Hello and welcome back for our fourth show of 2026. And this week we are continuing our challenge to Connecticut. We are hoping to achieve just a single week with no corruption. And I say this, of course, tongue in cheek, right? We've started off 2026 with this challenge every single week, but I think it's so important to point out the fact that this is alarmingly common. And it's one of the reasons that our newsroom even exists. As you already likely know, this is Inside Investigators Inside Update. I'm the editor, Connor Dragotis, and today I'm joined by senior investigative reporter Mark E. Fitch to chat about his newest investigation. It has to do with electroshock treatment and the increases to petitions for that. We're also going to talk about how hospitals are paying millions to cover state employee pay and benefits. Before we get to either of those, Mark, how you doing? We got a little sunshine yesterday. I know when this comes out on the radio on Saturday, we'll be in the middle of another snowstorm, but how were those few rays of sunshine coming through?
We better not have a snowstorm on Saturday. I thought it was supposed to warm up.
Well, I love your optimism, and please do not look at your weather app at all.
Okay.
And maybe we'll spare ourselves from that bad news. I think we should start with your investigation today. I
Sure.
think it's a really important one. And there has also been a number of outlets that have chatted about electroshock treatment. I am curious. I think if you're up for telling the story a little bit about seeing those start to come out as you're working on this, the little behind the curtain is interesting as well. But again, the title of this is Last Resort. And why did you go with that as the lead?
Well, what we're talking about here in the story is not just the electroshock treatment, which, if you're struggling with depression or something like that, could be an option. Absolutely. What we're talking about and what the story was kind of based on is petitions to the probate court to force somebody to have electroshock treatment. And that is typically the last resort that a hospital or a mental health institution is going to resort to when all other treatments have failed, medication's not working or not really doable in some cases when you start talking about elderly patients. And so the doctors and the institution itself will submit a petition to probate court if the patient is unwilling to move forward with ECT treatment, and essentially get a court order to make them do it. And that it's a thorny subject. Some of the things that we get into with the story is the effects of ECT. And I was actually really pleased, that somebody reached out saying that they had a great experience with it. Because one of my concerns is always when you put out a call for people to respond to something is you're generally going to get people who are upset about a particular
Yep.
subject. Um, so this particular woman reached out saying, "Hey, this really helped me, saved my life twice when I was dealing with postpartum depression and then a really severe bout of depression following a surgery." And it's one of those. In her case, it's one of those types of depression that ECT really seems to work well for when it's kind of situational, like postpartum, or some of the doctors I chatted with. They say it really works well on geriatric patients.
Hmm.
So there's people, there's certain situations and certain diagnoses that it works better for. But then I also talked to some people who had not so great experiences, people who were forced to undergo the treatment and really found it traumatizing. You do go under anesthesia, you are strapped down because it induces minor seizures. So yeah, it can be a scary prospect. Even the woman who said that, she really, that the treatment was great for her, said going in it was scary, So if you're somebody who's been institutionalized for mental health reasons to the point where they've reached this point where we're going to force you to undergo this, I'm sure at that point it's quite frightening.
That was one of the most interesting elements for me, at least. When I sit down and, we're looking at pitches and we're talking about topics, some of the stuff that I look for are, of course, the truly blatant, like initiation of violence, diminishment of wealth by force or fraud. But I'm also keeping an eye out for issues of consent, right? That's one where people are just, hey, I'm not agreeing to this, but it's happening to me anyway, type stuff. And obviously, when you're dealing with populations that very specifically are not necessarily able to make those decisions for themselves, the petition process was really interesting to me. So I guess, could you get into that a little bit about under what circumstances, or I guess the mindset of folks who did say, yeah, you know what, I'm at the point where I want to do this, I'm going to consent to it up front, versus the situations where, man, they are forced into it. And when that is considered legally acceptable, is there a gray area too? Might be an area to chat about.
So in order to get a court petition to require somebody to go under ECT treatment, it needs their treating doctor has to say that, all right, we've tried everything else and nothing else is working, and I feel this needs to be done. The patient has to be incapable of giving informed consent. So maybe they're catatonic in some instances. Maybe they're just, maybe they're delusional and think, have paranoid thoughts, things like that, where they're not making rational, logical decisions. But once their treating physician says, I think this needs to be done, they have to bring in a different physician who has not treated the patient to look over everything that the patient's gone through and agree with that assessment that a petition is needed. And then the institution itself has to agree that this needs to be done. So there's two doctors and then the head of an institution. And they
Gotcha.
all go to probate court. The probate court assigns the patient an attorney. And one of the things I kind of came across in my research was that, these attorneys, they're paid to represent the patient during this petition proceeding. But if the patient appeals the decision, the attorney doesn't get paid to go through the appeals
Huh.
process. So there's not a whole lot of incentive for an attorney to be like, hey, yeah, this is wrong, you should totally appeal this, because it's going to end up them doing a lot of work for free. But once the court grants the petition, the institution can move forward with administering the ECT treatment. And this is another interesting kind of aspect, because since the process can be appealed, and there are organizations like the Connecticut Legal Rights Project that files appeals on behalf of patients if they feel that they're being, unfairly petitioned. Even if the patient files an appeal, there's generally not a stay of the decision. So they can file an appeal, but still be forced to receive the treatment. Now, how often that happens, not really sure. According to my conversations with the Connecticut Legal Rights Project, oftentimes doctors will just say, hey, don't forget it. If you're appealing, forget it. We'll try some other things. But I mean, there was this instance, and it was adjudicated in court, was recently decided just this past December, where a woman being held in the Connecticut State Facilities, CVH in Middletown, she had received over 500 electroshock treatments, over the course of God knows how many years. And they were petitioning for another one. They were trying to re-up the petition so they could have another 45 days of treating her with electroshock therapy. And one of the cases that her attorney made was, hey, if this worked on her, it would have worked a long time ago, like at this point. And so
Right.
in that case, the court did grant them a stay. So she didn't have to undergo the treatment while it was in appeal. And they ultimately won, because the facility, the institution that was filing for the petition didn't go through all the checks and balances. They didn't have, the doctors weren't testifying that they had tried other things. There was some testimony missing. She appeared to be fairly cogent. So the judge in that case was like, no, this can't go forward. So there are checks and balances. It doesn't mean that there aren't cracks that can be slipped through, and it doesn't mean there can't be abuses.
One of the things that I didn't hear mentioned in those details, and which thank you for going through that, is either conservators of people who are there, or powers of attorney, right? Friends or family who are legally responsible for these. You said there's a court-appointed attorney, but are there those people who are supposed to have control and all these other elements? Do they get a voice in there? Are they part of this process, or is it truly this closed ecosystem?
They can have a voice, but it's not required. And so this is this is an interesting kind of gap in Connecticut state statute. So in order to forcibly medicate somebody, that patient must be because they're, and I should preface all this, if the patient's incapable of giving consent for any variety of reasons, in order to force medication on that patient, a conservator must be assigned to that patient. So a family member, an attorney, whoever, so that conservator can get all the information and give informed consent for that medication to be administered. With ECT treatment, a conservator is not necessary. You don't need to be conserved. They can just kind of go ahead and file their petition. So there's no informed consent requirement in that case, where somebody, who, family member or whoever who is assigned as a conservator, is able to get all the information, give informed consent, and then have the patient receive the ECT treatment. So that just seems like a notable gap, that it would be done for medication, but not for ECT treatment, which, all treatments and all medications have side effects, even Tylenol. Psychiatric medications can have some side effects, sometimes severe. Same with ECT treatment. I unfortunately, spoke with the mother of a young man who was facing severe depression, underwent ECT treatment, but the side effects became so severe that he couldn't continue, and ultimately took his life like 9 months later. Because there can be, side effects, memory loss, all sorts of different things, it seems like a notable gap that there would not be the requirement a conservator be assigned for something that is arguably more invasive than medication. So that's where the conservator part comes in, or essentially doesn't come in, when it comes to ECT treatment.
That's fascinating. That is really, really interesting to hear. And we certainly heard, since this was published on Sunday, we have gotten feedback. We have gotten folks saying, hey, we've gone through this. It saved my life. It was good. And on the other hand, we've also gotten folks who expletive-laced rants about the fact that we didn't call this torture and instead referred to it by its medical name, right? I mean, like this really ran the gambit of outright fury to, thank you for covering this in a way that wasn't just smashing on something that, as you point out in the article, most people know about this through pop culture, right? I don't think there's a great knowledge base about what ECT actually is in the modern era. And certainly not many representations, or I guess, let's say, just general public access to what this looks like in a modern clinical setting.
Sure.
I don't think that we necessarily need to get into what those details are, other than to say, read the article. And it does get into some of those pieces. Mark is obviously an incredibly talented writer, but he's also a really good storyteller, and someone who can, at least when I read your stuff, Mark, I'll say how much I love your writing without any hesitation. You bring out that emotional element, which I think is so important in something like this, which is clearly so personal to so many people. If it didn't have that part, if this was just data journalism, I really feel like it would have been missing something vital. So thank you for taking the time to do it right, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, and I will say, as far as the reactions, I mean, I got a phone call the morning the story came out from somebody I've known a while, but just through work. And he told me how he was dealing with a family member undergoing ECT treatment, and he was really thankful for the article. As far as and people being upset, not calling it torture and stuff like that, this all goes back to the 70s. This battle over ECT treatment, and certainly forced ECT treatment. I mean, this has got a long history. I'm sure a lot of people listening may be familiar with the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which kind of established in the general American audience what ECT treatment is. Unfortunately, the film representation was more akin to ECT treatment when it first started back in the 30s and 40s, as opposed to how it's actually administered, even at the time of the film. But that really set off this big battle that took place over decades between psychiatrists and psychiatric organizations, and what the people who had been through the mental health system, psychiatric survivor movement, essentially. And that continues today. We saw it. There was legislation put forward 2 years ago to extend the petition time from 45 days to 90 days. And we saw it right there in public hearing. Psychiatrists coming out saying, yes, this, we should do this, and this is a good thing. And people who had been through the mental health system and mental health advocacy groups, coming out and saying, hey, no, this is not a good thing to, make people do, and we shouldn't be extending these petition times. So that battle continues, and a lot of the language that you see, calling it torture and stuff like that's got a long history going back, to the 70s at least.
I won't berate it too much, but I'll be honest, the most recent thing, it's like American Horror Story, right? That's the modern iteration of that kind of, that's how it's being portrayed in so many ways, is those worst case scenarios. This, horror genre, I think, is where it plays out. I don't think that there's a lot of positive representation going on because it is such a hot topic, right?
Yeah, and yeah, it's an easy topic to kind of use for those kind of representations, because you're running electricity through somebody's brain. It sounds medieval. And honestly, like, when it started off, it kind of was medieval. So nowadays, they say it's much different, but some people disagree. Some people say, what, what happened to me when I was forced to undergo this was a form of torture, and that's their story, and I'm not gonna dispute that, because it sounds like it did not go well for them, and I can imagine being forced to undergo something like that would not be could be a very traumatic experience.
Without a doubt. I want to move on to the news story that we were going to talk about as well. And before we get there, I just want to put out, because I think that this is such an important part of writing these stories like Last Resort and all of our investigative work. For those of you who don't know, InsideInvestigator.org is a Connecticut-based investigative newsroom. We're a nonprofit, and there's a few things that set us apart. We don't have ads, we don't have paywalls, but we're also 100% donation supported. Voluntary donations allow this work to happen. Mark and our entire team have done some spectacular journalism to truly root out corruption in the state. We've seen resignations, we've seen program changes. Frankly, we've just seen human lives be improved as a result of our reporting team's work. If you would like to further support our work to end corruption in the state of Connecticut, please head to InsideInvestigator.org. Yes, of course, read the journalism, but also, if you like what you see, hit that donate button and help us grow our team, help us take care of our team better, help us do more of this work that positively impacts people's lives. Now, on to this news story. It's titled, "Hospitals Paying Millions to Cover State Employee Pay and Benefits." I'm going to let you do all of the explaining here, because this gets a little technical quite fast, but it was a great headline, and take it from here.
Yeah, so this concerns the Office of Health Strategy, which started in 2019 and is a office that the Lamont administration is proposing to get rid of in his latest budget. But it's also kind of an interesting state agency because it has been entirely funded by hidden taxes, essentially. Uh, most of the agency's funding comes from fees that are attached to insurance uh, policies. So, you know, up to like essentially per year, $100 million from insurance assessments goes into this special fund, and then that gets distributed to various departments. And it was the largest source of funding for the Office of Health Strategy. The second largest source of funding for OHS was a special assessment on hospitals to pay the employee costs for a specialized unit in their office that handled Connecticut's certificate of need process. Anybody who doesn't know, certificate of need is something that hospitals have to go through if they want to end services, expand services, buy new equipment, merge with another hospital. But basically anything that they want to undergo, they have to get permission from the state, and that's done through the certificate of need process. And essentially under state statute, the hospitals were paying the entire cost of this unit through this hidden tax, essentially, a yearly assessment that got up to about $6.5 million last year. And here's kind of the interesting part of it, though, is that assessment has grown about 40% over the last 4 years because the office started adding more employees to be covered under that assessment. So to the point where when we're looking at Lamont's budget at this point, he's proposing to get rid of the office and kind of move the employees to other departments. And he's going to take that unit, that special unit that handles the CON process, and put it back into the Department of Public Health where it used to be. And the employees, the cost of the employees for that unit going to the Department of Public Health is $2.8 million. So what was they were taking $6.5 million. Like, where did that come from? Like, what's going on here? Why, if the employees only cost $2.8 million to do the certificate of need process, and that is what the hospitals were being assessed for, why were they being assessed for essentially $4 million more? And if you go through the list of which employees are covered, it includes partial coverage for the commissioner and the legal director and God knows how many other people. There's multiple positions there. So it's one of those things where it was a department pretty much funded entirely by hidden taxes that actually raised the costs of insurance and healthcare because those hospitals aren't going to just eat $6.5 million. That gets rolled into what they charge to the rest of us. The insurance companies aren't going to eat $100 million. That gets passed down in the form of higher premiums. So as more and more departments try to cover more and more employees using these assessments, it's just raising the cost for everyone else, and to me, it's like if you're a government and you have employees, those are your employees. They shouldn't be paid for by special things, by particular constituents, and hospitals being one of them.
It's such an interesting article, and I'm glad we're talking about it because for me, it really plays after our corruption mission in two ways. One is, of course, the upstream issue of transparency, which is really hard to, there is a dam when it comes to transparency. And there are so many things that we know are going wrong. We receive tips about going wrong. And then, yes, we're always happy to get the trickles that make their way through. But with all of the efforts to, stick their fingers in the dam and stop this information from getting out, when stuff does come down and we see that, come on, this is crazy. How many times are we talking about the outrageous cost of healthcare generally? And when we see intrusion into the ability to access what people need to be healthy, I mean, this is very clearly an instance where, corruption is running rampant. And again, I'm just so thankful that you're writing about this, and most importantly, explaining it. I did feel like you did a good job here, bringing out the different angles and, frankly, the ongoing debate. Right, this is not resolved. This is not over, and we've been writing about healthcare, and I do not expect that we will stop writing about healthcare. But goodness, there are a lot of smart people out there, and I really feel like there would be a huge benefit to more eyeballs on the problem, instead of creating this whole bureaucracy. You mentioned this growing staff too, right? So was it new staff coming in, or just they said, well, Joe over here, maybe he could be part of the group that's assessed under this pot of money?
It's difficult to tell. I did ask OHS, and they're like, "Oh, we don't have enough time to get all that, information to you by deadline." So they gave me, they point to the fact that, and I think it is more staff, and then more existing staff being covered. Saying like, "All right, the legal director has to, sign some documents for the CON process, so part of his salary should be covered by this." I'm just using that as an example.
Sure.
But yeah, I think OHS points to the fact that the CON process has been sped up. It's more efficient. They're getting more, it's less time between application and approval, which I guess is good.
I guess, yeah. Could you explain a little? I know you said that there are a bunch of different buckets for but what problem is it intending to fix? I don't know many business owners who go out and just buy an MRI machine. I don't know. I've a lot of people who work in healthcare in my life. So why does this exist in the first place?
The CON process?
Yeah. And I know we're down to the last couple minutes here, and maybe we could push this off to another time, but that's the question that just popped into my mind is, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
It's less people actually providing healthcare.
Yeah, not every state actually does the CON process. And fun fact, during COVID, they suspended the CON process so that the hospitals could adapt more quickly to, clear out units and, get all the things that they needed to potentially treat masses of people coming in. So if it's necessary during an emergency, what does that tell you, about
Yes.
the process itself? It's a process that's used by a number of states, not all though. It's been criticized as to essentially, the government dictating what these hospitals can and cannot do. I think and it's been a little while since I've done research into CON, but if I remember correctly, it's to ensure that there is proper coverage, healthcare coverage for everybody in the state, everybody in a particular region. So for instance, I believe it was Wyndham Hospital. Wyndham Hospital wanted to end their birthing unit and had to go through the CON process to try to do that, and was rejected. So they have to keep their birthing, center. Now, what does that mean for Wyndham Hospital's finances? I don't know. But clearly they wanted to do away with it for some reason. The other thing is like hospital mergers. We see a lot of those. Hartford Healthcare has grown quite a bit over the past few years, and now essentially, the state of Connecticut's getting into it with UConn purchasing, some of the Prospect hospitals. But the CON process, either approves or denies that as well. So, sometimes those mergers can, create economies of scale where maybe it lowers healthcare costs. But there's been numerous lawsuits against Hartford Healthcare specifically, claiming it's a monopoly because it's expanded so much that you don't really have any choice as to where you're going. So how useful the CON process is, and whether or not it disrupts healthcare systems and makes them less efficient, that is a debate that does happen. I know there have been some studies done specifically on the process in Connecticut. I don't recall off the top of my head what their findings were, but it's not a kind of set and done, agreed upon process that everybody thinks is beneficial.
Without a doubt. We're going to have to put a pin in it there. As much as I would love to, get more into the invisible hand of the market. I believe this month is the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So we'll save that for another time as well. I really appreciate your work on this, Mark. I know this was one that really came together well, and credit to Joe as well for some really interesting artwork on it. I feel like it's evocative, it's emotional, and it properly captures a lot of what's going on here. Thank you also to all of you who tuned in live. Thank you to everyone listening on the radio. Please head over to insideinvestigator.org, read the stories, check out our content. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and until then, please don't be corrupt.